Lord Alexander Blackthorne had ruled the shadowy realm of Valen Hall for over 3 centuries, commanding respect and fear from both vampires and humans alike. His castle, perched on the edge of a cliff overlooking the misty valleys below, housed dozens of servants who maintained his vast estate. Among them was Elena Martinez, a young woman of 24 who had been working as a maid in the castle for just 6 months. Elena was different from the other servants. While most of them moved through the castle with downcast eyes and trembling hands, she carried herself with quiet confidence. Her dark hair was always neatly braided, and her brown eyes held a spark of intelligence that hadn't gone unnoticed by the vampire lord. She performed her duties efficiently, cleaning the grand halls, polishing ancient artifacts, and maintaining the library that contained thousands of rare books. What intrigued Alexander most about Elena was her fearlessness. Unlike the other servants who would scatter like frightened mice whenever he appeared, Elena would simply bow respectfully and continue with her work. She never stammered or dropped things in his presence, and there was something in her demeanor that suggested she knew more than she let on. The castle followed a strict routine. During daylight hours, Alexander would retreat to his chambers, allowing the human servants to work freely throughout the castle. Elena had been assigned to clean the west wing, which included the vampire lord's study and the adjacent sitting room. These were sacred spaces that required the utmost care as they contained priceless artifacts and documents spanning centuries. On this particular autumn morning, Alexander found himself unusually restless. The previous night's council meeting with other vampire lords had been tense, filled with discussions of territorial disputes and the increasing boldness of vampire hunters in neighboring regions. Instead of falling into his usual deep slumber, he decided to feign sleep and observe the daily activities of his castle from the shadows. Using his supernatural abilities, Alexander positioned himself in a way that allowed him to watch the servants without being detected. He had done this before, mainly to ensure his staff wasn't stealing from him or plotting against him. Most of the servants were predictably boring. They would hurry through their tasks, whispering nervously to each other about their mysterious master. But Elena was scheduled to clean his study that morning, and Alexander found himself curious about how she behaved when she thought she was completely alone. He had noticed small changes in his study over the past few weeks. Books that were slightly out of place, papers that had been carefully moved and replaced, and a general sense that someone had been examining his possessions with great attention to detail. As the morning sun filtered through the heavy curtains of the castle, Elena entered the study carrying her cleaning supplies. Alexander watched from his hidden vantage point as she began her work. At first, she performed the usual tasks, dusting the furniture, sweeping the floor, and organizing the papers on his massive oak desk. Her movements were graceful and efficient, showing a familiarity with the room that came from weeks of careful work. However, after about an hour of routine cleaning, Elena's behavior changed dramatically. She moved to the door and listened carefully, ensuring that no one else was nearby. Satisfied that she was alone, she walked directly to Alexander's private bookshelf, a section that was supposed to be off-limits to all servants. Her fingers traced along the spines of ancient leather-bound volumes until she found what she was looking for. Alexander watched in fascination as Elena pulled out a thick tome titled Chronicles of the Bloodline Wars. This was no ordinary history book. It contained detailed accounts of vampire politics, territorial battles, and the complex relationships between different vampire houses. It was written in an ancient dialect that most humans couldn't even read, let alone understand. But Elena opened the book with confidence and began reading, her eyes moving quickly across the pages as if she was searching for specific information. She occasionally paused to take notes on a small piece of paper that she kept hidden in her apron pocket. Alexander could see that she was particularly interested in the sections dealing with his own family history and the alliances he had formed over the centuries. What stunned Alexander even more was Elena's apparent fluency in the ancient language. She wasn't just looking at pictures or pretending to read. She was actually comprehending the complex political and historical information contained in the text. This suggested an education far beyond what any ordinary maid would possess. After spending nearly 30 minutes with the book, Elena carefully returned it to its exact position on the shelf. She then moved to another restricted area of the study, a locked cabinet where Alexander kept his most sensitive correspondence. To his amazement, Elena produced a small set of lockpicks from her apron and skillfully opened the cabinet. Inside were letters from other vampire lords, reports from his spies in human cities, and detailed maps showing the locations of various vampire territories. Elena photographed several documents using a small camera that she had concealed in her cleaning supplies. Her movements were quick and professional, suggesting that this wasn't her first time engaging in such activities. Alexander's mind raced as he watched this unexpected display. Elena wasn't just a curious servant satisfying her own interest. She was clearly gathering intelligence with a specific purpose in mind. The way she handled the lockpicks, her knowledge of what to look for, and her ability to read ancient vampire texts all pointed to extensive training and preparation. As Elena finished photographing the documents and carefully locked the cabinet again, she moved to one final location that made Alexander's blood run cold. She approached a seemingly ordinary section of the wall and pressed a specific combination of stones, revealing a hidden compartment that Alexander thought no one else knew about. Inside this secret space were his most guarded possessions, artifacts that could be used to control or harm him, and documents that revealed the true extent of his power and influence. Elena examined these items with the same professional attention she had given everything else, taking careful notes and photographs. Alexander realized that she had somehow discovered not just one, but all of his secret hiding places. This level of knowledge could only have come from extensive surveillance and planning, or from information provided by someone with intimate knowledge of the castle. The most shocking moment came when Elena pulled out a small vial of what appeared to be holy water and a wooden stake from her apron. For a terrifying instant, Alexander thought she might be a vampire hunter who had infiltrated his household to kill him. But instead of preparing for an attack, Elena examined these items thoughtfully and then returned them to their hiding place in her apron. As Elena finished her mysterious activities and returned to normal cleaning duties, Alexander found himself completely bewildered. Who was this woman who had been living under his roof for 6 months? Was she a spy working for his enemies, a vampire hunter gathering information for a future attack, or something else entirely? Her actions suggested sophisticated training and a clear mission, but her behavior toward him had always been respectful and professional. The most disturbing aspect of the entire situation was how thoroughly Elena had mapped out his secrets without him noticing. Alexander prided himself on his ability to read people and detect deception. Yet this young woman had been operating right under his nose without raising any serious suspicions. Her performance as an ordinary maid had been so convincing that he had dismissed her as just another servant. As the morning wore on, Elena completed her cleaning duties and left the study, her behavior returning to that of a normal domestic worker. Alexander remained hidden, his mind spinning with questions and concerns. He had built his power over centuries by being careful, suspicious, and always staying one step ahead of potential threats. Yet Elena had managed to penetrate his defenses and access his most closely guarded secrets. The implications were staggering. If Elena was working for rival vampire lords, she now possessed enough information to seriously damage his position. If she was connected to vampire hunters, his entire household could be at risk. But there was also the possibility that she represented some other faction or interest group that he hadn't considered. Alexander realized that his usual methods of dealing with potential threats, intimidation, violence, or simple elimination might not be appropriate in this situation. Elena's actions, while clearly deceptive, hadn't been directly hostile. She hadn't attempted to harm him or steal anything of obvious value. Instead, she seemed to be gathering information for some larger purpose that remained unclear. As evening approached and Alexander prepared to begin his nightly activities, he found himself facing a dilemma unlike any he had encountered in his long existence. Elena represented either the most sophisticated threat he had ever faced or possibly an opportunity for something entirely unexpected. Her intelligence, skills, and mysterious agenda made her far more than just a servant who had stumbled upon his secrets. The vampire lord decided that simply confronting Elena directly would likely result in her either fleeing or providing carefully prepared lies. Instead, he needed to learn more about her true identity and motivations before deciding how to proceed. This would require patience and careful observation, qualities that had served him well over his centuries of existence. but had never been tested by someone as enigmatic as Elena Martinez. Alexander's fascination with his mysterious maid had evolved into something much more complex. She had demonstrated abilities and knowledge that challenged his understanding of who she really was, and her presence in his castle now seemed far from coincidental. Whatever Elena's true purpose might be, Alexander knew that his previously predictable existence was about to become much more complicated and potentially dangerous. Over the following weeks, Alexander began his own careful investigation into Elena Martinez. Using his network of contacts and supernatural abilities, he discovered that the young woman's background was far more complex than her employment records suggested. According to the documents provided when she was hired, Elena had grown up in a small village and had worked as a domestic servant in several wealthy households before arriving at his castle. However, Alexander's deeper investigation revealed inconsistencies in her story. The village she claimed to be from had no record of her family, and the previous employers she had listed gave conflicting accounts of her service. It became clear that Elena Martinez was either not her real name or her entire background had been carefully fabricated to conceal her true identity. What intrigued Alexander even more was Elena's behavior during the evening hours. While most of the human servants retired early to their quarters, Elena often remained active well into the night. Using his ability to move unseen through shadows, Alexander began following her during these late-night activities, curious about what she did when her official duties were complete. Elena's nocturnal routine was as methodical and purposeful as her daytime spying. She would wait until the castle grew quiet, then make her way to different sections of the building that she wasn't normally assigned to clean. Alexander watched as she mapped out the entire castle's layout, taking careful note of secret passages, hidden rooms, and security measures that even some of his longest-serving staff didn't know about. But Elena's activities weren't limited to the castle itself. On several nights, Alexander observed her leaving the castle grounds entirely, moving through the surrounding forest with the confidence of someone familiar with the terrain. She would disappear for hours at a time, returning just before dawn with mud on her boots and sometimes small items concealed in her clothing. Curiosity eventually overcame caution, and Alexander decided to follow Elena during one of her midnight excursions. Using his supernatural speed and stealth, he tracked her as she made her way through the dense woods surrounding his estate. To his surprise, Elena led him to a small, abandoned cabin about 2 miles from the castle, a structure he had forgotten existed after decades of neglect. Inside the cabin, Elena had created what appeared to be a command center. Maps of the surrounding region covered the walls, marked with symbols and notations that Alexander didn't immediately recognize. There were charts showing the locations of other vampire territories, detailed drawings of various supernatural creatures, and what looked like intelligence reports written in multiple languages. Most shocking of all were several photographs of Alexander himself, taken from angles that suggested extensive surveillance. Elena spent her time in the cabin analyzing documents, updating her maps, and communicating with unknown parties using a small radio device. Alexander listened as she provided detailed reports about the castle's defenses, his daily routines, and the activities of other vampire lords in the region. Her voice was calm and professional, suggesting that she was accustomed to this type of intelligence gathering. From these overheard communications, Alexander learned that Elena was indeed working for an organization, though he couldn't initially determine which one. She used code names and cryptic language that made it difficult to understand the full scope of her mission. However, it became clear that her infiltration of his household was part of a larger operation involving multiple targets and objectives. What puzzled Alexander was the tone of Elena's reports. While she provided detailed information about his capabilities and activities, she didn't sound like someone preparing for an attack or plotting his destruction. Instead, her communications suggested that she was gathering intelligence for defensive rather than offensive purposes. She seemed particularly interested in his relationships with other vampire lords and his potential reactions to various political scenarios. Alexander also noticed that Elena never reported some of his most dangerous secrets or vulnerabilities. During her time in his study, she had discovered information that could have been used to seriously harm him, yet she hadn't shared these details with her handlers. This selective reporting suggested either personal discretion or instructions to avoid crossing certain lines. The most revealing moment came when Alexander overheard Elena discussing him directly with her contact. Instead of the cold, analytical tone she used when describing castle defenses or political intelligence, her voice took on a different quality when talking about him personally. She described his behavior toward his servants as surprisingly fair and mentioned that he showed more restraint and consideration than she had expected from someone in his position. Elena's contact seemed surprised by these observations and pressed her for more details about Alexander's character and motivations. She hesitated before responding, then provided a complex analysis of his personality that demonstrated remarkable insight. She had been watching him just as carefully as he had been watching her, noting his habits, preferences, and the subtle ways he interacted with different people. What stunned Alexander most was Elena's assessment that he wasn't the ruthless, power-hungry tyrant that her organization had apparently expected. She described him as calculating and dangerous, but also capable of honor and even kindness when it served his purposes. Her analysis was more nuanced and accurate than most people who had known him for decades could have provided. As Alexander continued his surveillance of Elena's nocturnal activities, he began to piece together a clearer picture of who she really was and why she was in his castle. Elena appeared to be working for some kind of supernatural intelligence agency, an organization that monitored vampire activities and gathered information about potential threats to human populations. Her mission wasn't necessarily to harm him, but to understand his capabilities and intentions. This revelation changed Alexander's perspective on Elena's presence in his household. Rather than viewing her as a direct threat, he began to see her as a representative of forces that were trying to maintain some kind of balance between the supernatural and human worlds. Her careful professional approach suggested that her organization preferred intelligence gathering and diplomacy to outright conflict. However, Alexander also realized that Elena's situation was potentially precarious. If her handlers decided that he posed too great a threat, they might order her to take more direct action. Alternatively, if other vampire lords discovered her true identity, they might use her as a way to strike at him or gain leverage in their ongoing political struggles. The complexity of the situation was further complicated by Alexander's growing respect for Elena's abilities. Her intelligence, resourcefulness, and professionalism impressed him in ways that few people had managed over his long existence. She had infiltrated his household, mapped his secrets, and gathered extensive intelligence while maintaining perfect cover for months. Such skills were rare and valuable regardless of her current allegiances. Alexander found himself in the unusual position of admiring someone who was essentially spying on him. Elena's competence and dedication reminded him of the qualities he valued in his most trusted associates. Her ability to maintain her cover while gathering such detailed intelligence demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking and operational discipline that he employed in his own activities. As weeks passed, Alexander noticed subtle changes in Elena's behavior that suggested she might be experiencing some conflict about her mission. Her reports to her handlers became less frequent, and she spent more time observing him personally rather than just gathering information about his activities. During their brief interactions in the castle, Alexander detected hints of genuine curiosity in her manner, as if she was trying to understand him as a person rather than just as a target of investigation. The turning point came when Alexander decided to test Elena's intentions directly. He began leaving certain documents in locations where she would easily find them. Information that would be valuable to her handlers, but that would also reveal whether she was sharing everything she discovered. To his surprise, many of these deliberately placed items never appeared in her subsequent reports, suggesting that she was exercising considerable discretion about what intelligence she passed along. This selective reporting indicated that Elena had developed her own judgment about what information was truly necessary for her mission and what might be unnecessarily harmful to him. Such personal discretion was remarkable in someone who was supposed to be conducting professional intelligence gathering. It suggested that Elena's perception of him had evolved beyond the simple threat assessment that had originally brought her to his castle. Alexander realized that Elena's situation was as complex as his own, She was clearly committed to her mission and loyal to her organization, but she had also developed a more nuanced understanding of him as an individual. This created tension between her professional obligations and her personal observations, a conflict that Alexander found both intriguing and potentially advantageous. The vampire lord began to consider possibilities he had never contemplated before. Elena represented a direct link to the mysterious organization that was monitoring his activities. Rather than viewing this as purely threatening, he began to see it as an opportunity for communication and potentially even cooperation. If Elena's handlers were interested in maintaining stability rather than creating chaos, there might be common ground for discussion. However, Alexander also recognized the risks involved in any attempt to engage with Elena directly. If he revealed that he knew about her true identity and activities, she might flee or her organization might decide to eliminate the compromise to their operation. Alternatively, other vampire lords might view any communication with human intelligence agencies as treasonous, putting his own position at risk. As Alexander weighed these considerations, he found himself increasingly fascinated by the young woman who had so thoroughly disrupted his previously predictable existence. Elena had proven herself to be far more than just another servant or even just another spy. She was an individual of remarkable capabilities operating in an extremely complex situation, much like himself. The question now was whether they could find a way to resolve their mutual surveillance without destroying each other in the process. The delicate balance of surveillance and counter-surveillance continued for another month before an unexpected crisis forced both Alexander and Elena to reveal their hands. A group of rogue vampires from a neighboring territory launched a surprise attack on Alexander's castle, seeking to eliminate him and claim his lands for themselves. The assault came during daylight hours when Alexander was supposed to be at his most vulnerable, suggesting that the attackers had inside information about his routines. Elena was cleaning in the main hall when the attack began. Alexander, who had been resting in his chambers, was immediately alert to the danger. Using his supernatural speed, he moved through the castle to assess the threat and protect his household. What he discovered shocked him even more than Elena's previous revelations. Instead of cowering in fear like the other servants, Elena had immediately sprung into action when the attack started. She moved through the castle with military precision, helping to evacuate the human staff while simultaneously setting up defensive positions. More surprisingly, she seemed to have weapons and equipment hidden throughout the castle that she now deployed with expert efficiency. Alexander watched in amazement as Elena coordinated the defense of his human servants while he dealt with the supernatural threat posed by the attacking vampires. She had somehow anticipated this type of scenario and prepared contingency plans that she now executed flawlessly. Her actions saved the lives of several servants who would otherwise have been killed in the crossfire. During the height of the battle, Alexander found himself fighting alongside Elena against their common enemies. She wielded weapons that were specifically designed to harm vampires, including silver-edged blades and specially consecrated ammunition. Her combat skills were professional grade, and she fought with the calm efficiency of someone who had faced supernatural opponents before. The most stunning moment came when one of the attacking vampires managed to wound Alexander seriously. As he struggled to recover from the injury, Elena positioned herself between him and his attacker. Despite the fact that she was far outmatched in terms of raw physical power, her willingness to risk her own life to protect him made it clear that whatever her original mission might have been, her loyalties had become far more complex. Working together, Alexander and Elena managed to repel the attack, though not without significant damage to the castle and injury to several staff members. In the aftermath of the battle, as they tended to the wounded and secured the grounds, both of them knew that their previous game of hidden surveillance had come to an end. The crisis had forced them to show their true capabilities and intentions. That evening, after the immediate danger had passed and the castle had been secured, Alexander finally confronted Elena directly. He found her in the servants' quarters treating the injuries of other staff members with medical supplies that were far too sophisticated for an ordinary maid to possess. Her gentle care for the wounded servants, combined with her lethal efficiency during the battle, painted a picture of someone with complex motivations and loyalties. When Alexander approached her, Elena looked up with eyes that showed no surprise at being discovered. She had clearly known that their mutual deception couldn't continue indefinitely, especially after the day's events had forced both of them to act outside their assumed roles. Without speaking, she finished bandaging the wounded servant's arm before turning to face Alexander directly. Their conversation, when it finally came, was unlike any Alexander had experienced in his centuries of existence. Elena confirmed what he had already deduced. She was indeed an agent working for an organization dedicated to monitoring supernatural activities and protecting human populations from dangerous creatures. However, her mission parameters had been far more complex than simple intelligence gathering. Elena explained that her organization had initially viewed Alexander as a potential threat due to his power and influence in the vampire community. However, her months of observation had convinced her that he was actually one of the more stable and reasonable vampire lords in the region. Her reports had gradually shifted from warning about a dangerous threat to describing him as a potential asset in maintaining supernatural stability. The attack on his castle had been orchestrated by vampire lords who opposed any cooperation between supernatural beings and human organizations. They had learned about Elena's presence in Alexander's household and decided to eliminate both of them before any formal agreements could be reached. The timing of the attack, during daylight hours when Alexander should have been helpless, was intended to make his death appear to be the result of his own overconfidence rather than organized opposition. Elena revealed that her organization had been tracking these rogue vampires for months and had suspected they might target Alexander's territory. Her mission had evolved from simple surveillance to protecting him from threats that neither of them could handle alone. The weapons and defensive preparations she had made throughout the castle were part of a contingency plan to defend against exactly the type of attack they had just survived. Alexander found himself impressed not just by Elena's skills and dedication, but by the sophistication of the organization she represented. Her handlers had clearly spent considerable time and resources understanding the complex politics of vampire society and identifying which individuals and factions posed genuine threats to human safety. Their approach suggested a level of strategic thinking that rivaled his own. More importantly, Elena's personal evolution during her time in his household had created possibilities that neither of them had originally anticipated. Her initial assessment of him as a potential threat had gradually transformed into recognition of him as someone who could be reasoned with and potentially worked with. Similarly, Alexander's suspicion of her as a possible assassin had evolved into respect for her professionalism and integrity. The conversation revealed that both of them had been operating under false assumptions about each other's intentions. Elena had expected to find a ruthless tyrant who ruled through fear and violence. Instead, she had discovered someone who was certainly dangerous and calculating, but who also showed consideration for his servants and restraint in his use of power. Alexander had assumed that Elena represented a direct threat to his existence, when in fact she had become something closer to an unwitting protector. As they talked through the night, Alexander and Elena began to explore the possibility of formal cooperation between his household and her organization. The benefits to both sides were significant. Alexander would gain access to intelligence about threats from other supernatural factions, while Elena's organization would have a reliable ally among the vampire lords who could help maintain stability in the region. However, both of them also recognized the risks involved in such cooperation. Other vampire lords would view any alliance with human organizations as treachery, potentially leading to the kind of coordinated attacks they had just survived. Elena's organization might also face internal opposition from members who preferred to treat all supernatural beings as enemies rather than potential allies. The solution they developed was characteristically subtle and complex. Elena would remain in Alexander's household, but her role would gradually transition from spy to liaison. She would continue to provide intelligence to her organization, but would also serve as a channel for communication between Alexander and her handlers. This arrangement would allow both sides to explore cooperation without making formal commitments that could be exploited by their enemies. To maintain their cover, Elena would continue to work as a maid while gradually taking on additional responsibilities that would give her legitimate reasons to access sensitive information and communicate with outside contacts. Alexander would publicly treat her as a trusted servant who had proven herself during the recent crisis, while privately working with her to identify and counter threats from hostile supernatural factions. The arrangement also included provisions for Elena's safety and security within Alexander's household. Some of his vampire associates would undoubtedly become suspicious of any human who gained his trust, and Elena would need protection from potential retaliation. Alexander agreed to provide her with resources and support that would allow her to defend herself against supernatural threats while maintaining her cover identity. Over the following months, this unusual partnership proved remarkably effective. Elena's intelligence network provided Alexander with early warning about political developments and potential threats that allowed him to avoid several dangerous situations. In return, his cooperation helped her organization prevent conflicts between supernatural factions that could have resulted in significant human casualties. The working relationship between Alexander and Elena also evolved on a personal level. Their mutual respect, forged during the crisis that had revealed their true identities, deepened as they worked together on increasingly complex challenges. Elena's intelligence and strategic thinking complemented Alexander's experience and supernatural capabilities, creating a partnership that was more effective than either of them could have been alone. However, both of them remained aware that their cooperation existed in a delicate balance that could be disrupted by changes in the larger political situation. Other vampire lords continued to view Alexander's restraint and stability with suspicion, while some members of Elena's organization remained convinced that all supernatural beings were inherently dangerous. The success of their partnership depended on their ability to demonstrate that cooperation between humans and vampires could serve everyone's interests better than continued conflict. The transformation of their relationship from mutual surveillance to active cooperation represented something unprecedented in Alexander's long existence. Elena had begun as a threat to be monitored and potentially eliminated, but had become a valued ally whose insights and capabilities enhanced his own effectiveness. For Elena, Alexander had evolved from a dangerous target requiring constant vigilance to a complex individual whose partnership offered opportunities to advance her organization's mission in ways that pure opposition never could. Their story demonstrated that even in a world where supernatural beings and humans viewed each other with suspicion and fear, individuals of intelligence and integrity could find common ground for cooperation. The vampire king and the maid who had spied on him had discovered that their apparent conflict masked deeper shared interests in maintaining stability and preventing the chaos that would result from escalating supernatural warfare. As they continued to work together, both Alexander and Elena knew that they were pioneering a new model for human-vampire relations that could either transform their world or destroy them both. The risks were enormous, but so were the potential benefits of proving that cooperation was possible between beings who had traditionally viewed each other as natural enemies. Their partnership had become not just a practical alliance, but a test of whether ancient prejudices could be overcome by mutual respect and shared goals.